The sweltering heat of a southern summer bore down on the town like an oppressive hand. Evelyn Carter wiped the thin sheen of sweat from her brow as she approached the bus stop, her leather handbag clutched tightly against her side. The streets buzzed with the daily routines of people going about their lives, but Evelyn felt the stares, subtle yet piercing, as she passed. It wasn't the first time she'd been judged for her mere presence, and it wouldn't be the last. The bus arrived with a groan of brakes and a cloud of dust. Its faded paint and creaking doors spoke of years of use. Evelyn stepped up onto the first step and met the eyes of the driver. Frank Dawson, a burly man with a weathered face and a permanent scowl, didn't bother to hide his disdain. His eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a sneer as Evelyn handed over her fare. "Seats in the back," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. It was more than an instruction. It was a declaration of his authority, a reminder of the unspoken rules that governed their segregated world. Evelyn's grip tightened on her handbag. Her heart pounded, and for a fleeting moment, she considered arguing. She'd read about people like her standing their ground, refusing to bow to the injustices of the system. But as she glanced behind her, the disapproving stares from the other passengers told her what she already knew. Resistance here and now would cost her more than she was prepared to pay. She swallowed her pride and nodded, taking a step down the aisle. The front seats were occupied by white passengers, their gazes ranging from indifferent to hostile. Evelyn kept her eyes forward, her shoulders squared, and made her way to the back of the bus, where a few black passengers sat in silence. She slid into an empty seat by the window, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. The bus jerked into motion, its engine groaning as it made its way through the town. Evelyn's gaze drifted out the window to the streets she'd walked so many times before. Children played on sidewalks, shopkeepers arranged their displays, and life moved on, oblivious to the turmoil in her heart. She thought about her job at the sewing factory, the long hours and meager pay, and the endless struggle to prove her worth in a world that seemed determined to diminish her. The ride was uneventful at first, the bus swaying gently as it followed its route. But as more passengers boarded, the tension grew. Each new face brought another layer of discomfort, another pair of eyes that seemed to judge Evelyn for sitting where she was. The air inside the bus felt thick and oppressive, and the heat only made it worse. Suddenly, the bus lurched and shuddered to a stop. A loud clank echoed through the cabin, followed by the unmistakable hiss of steam escaping from the engine. Frank slammed on the brakes, nearly throwing the passengers from their seats, and cursed under his breath as he stood to inspect the damage. "Everyone stay put," he growled, his tone making it clear that he wouldn't tolerate any complaints. Evelyn glanced around, noting the looks of confusion and annoyance on the faces of the other passengers. The bus had broken down on a deserted stretch of road, with nothing but fields and the blazing sun in every direction. The oppressive heat became even more unbearable without the faint breeze created by the moving vehicle. "Figures," muttered a man sitting near the front. "These old buses ain't good for nothin'." Frank climbed down from the driver's seat and stomped to the front of the bus, muttering under his breath as he examined the engine. The passengers waited in stifling silence, the tension in the air palpable. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling the sweat trickle down her back. She opened her bag and pulled out a handkerchief, dabbing at her neck and forehead. The quiet was broken by a faint whimper. Evelyn turned her head and saw a young boy, no older than 4, sitting with his mother a few seats away. His face was flushed, his tiny chest heaving with labored breaths. The mother fanned him frantically with a folded newspaper, her face etched with worry. Evelyn's heart ached at the sight. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small bottle of water she'd saved for emergencies. Rising from her seat, she moved toward the mother and child, ignoring the curious and disapproving glances from the other passengers. "Here," she said softly, offering the bottle. "Let him have some water." The mother looked up at her, gratitude and hesitation flickering across her face. She accepted the bottle with trembling hands and carefully brought it to her son's lips. The boy drank greedily, his breathing slowing as the water soothed him. "Thank you," the mother whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Before Evelyn could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "What do you think you're doing?" Evelyn turned to see Frank glaring at her from the front of the bus. His face was red, whether from the heat or his anger. She couldn't tell. He stomped down the aisle, his heavy boots thudding against the metal floor. "I told you to stay in your seat," he snapped. "You got no business wandering around, causing trouble." Evelyn straightened her back, meeting his gaze with calm defiance. "The boy needed water," she said evenly. "He's not well." Frank's eyes narrowed. "You think you can just do whatever you please? Rules exist for a reason. And what rule says I can't help someone in need?" Evelyn shot back, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling within her. A murmur rippled through the passengers. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked away, unwilling to take sides. Frank's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed he might lash out. But then he glanced at the watching eyes and seemed to think better of it. He turned on his heel and stomped back to the front of the bus, muttering curses under his breath. Evelyn returned to her seat, her heart pounding. The mother of the boy gave her a grateful nod, and the child, now resting against his mother's shoulder, offered a small, weary smile. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. As the minutes dragged on, the sun climbed higher, and the heat inside the bus became unbearable. Frank's attempts to fix the engine proved futile, and his frustration was evident in the loud clanging of tools and his muttered curses. The passengers' patience wore thin, and the murmur of discontent grew louder. Evelyn's thoughts wandered as she stared out the window, her gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon. She thought about the countless indignities she and others like her endured every day, about the quiet strength it took to keep moving forward in a world that seemed determined to push them down. She wondered how long she could keep going, how much more she could endure. A sudden honk shattered her reverie. Evelyn turned her head just in time to see a truck barreling down the road toward them. The driver's frantic honking and the screech of brakes filled the air, and Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the truck swerved, heading straight for the stalled bus. Time seemed to slow as chaos erupted. Passengers screamed and braced themselves as the truck collided with the side of the bus, sending it careening off the road. Evelyn was thrown from her seat, her head striking the window with a sickening thud. The world spun, and then everything went black. The aftermath of the crash was a chaotic blur of sound and motion. Evelyn Carter groaned as she regained consciousness, her head pounding and her vision swimming. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of gasoline. The bus lay tilted on its side, its windows shattered, and its metal frame crumpled from the impact. Passengers were scattered, some moaning in pain, others struggling to free themselves from the wreckage. Evelyn blinked, trying to focus as the world slowly came back into view. Her hands felt for something to steady herself, and she realized she was wedged between a seat and the cracked window pane. With a grunt, she pushed herself upright, ignoring the sharp pain in her ribs. Around her, the groans and cries of the injured filled the air. She spotted the young mother and her son a few feet away, the boy clinging to his mother's neck, sobbing. Evelyn crawled toward them, her movements slow and deliberate. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice hoarse. The mother looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I think so," she said, her voice trembling. "But my son, he's—" Evelyn placed a gentle hand on the boy's back, feeling the shallow rise and fall of his chest. "He's breathing," she reassured the mother. "Let's get out of here." She helped the mother to her feet, her own legs shaking from the effort. Together, they climbed through the broken window, careful to avoid the jagged edges of glass. Outside, the sun blazed down mercilessly, but the open air felt like a relief compared to the stifling confines of the bus. Other passengers were already making their way out, some limping, others helping those who were too injured to move on their own. Frank Dawson, the bus driver, stood a few yards away, leaning heavily on the hood of the bus. His face was pale, and his leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. Despite his injuries, he barked orders at anyone within earshot. "Help me get this damn thing upright," he shouted, pointing to a group of men. "We need to move it off the road before another truck comes." Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she watched him. Even now, in the midst of disaster, he seemed more concerned with the bus than with the people who'd been hurt. She turned her attention back to the mother and child, guiding them to a shady spot by the side of the road. "Stay here," she said firmly. "I'll see if anyone else needs help." The mother nodded, clutching her son tightly. Evelyn made her way back to the bus, where a small group of passengers had gathered. Some were assisting the injured, while others stood by, unsure of what to do. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice steady and commanding. "We need to get everyone out first," she said. "Then we can worry about the bus." A few heads turned her way, and she could see the doubt in their eyes. But one by one, they nodded, realizing she was right. Together, they began pulling people from the wreckage, each small victory a testament to their resilience. As they worked, Evelyn couldn't help but notice the divide among the passengers. The white passengers clustered together, some openly ignoring the black passengers who were struggling to free themselves. It was as if the crash had done nothing to erase the barriers that society had built between them. "Hey," Evelyn called out to a young white man who was standing idly by. "We need help over here." The man hesitated, his gaze flickering between Evelyn and Frank, who was still barking orders. After a moment, he moved toward her, helping to lift a woman from the debris. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Hours passed, though it felt like an eternity. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the scene. The injured were laid out in the shade, their wounds tended to as best as possible with the limited resources available. Evelyn worked tirelessly, her own pain forgotten, as she focused on helping others. Eventually, the sound of sirens broke through the oppressive silence. Ambulances and police cars arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the dimming light. Paramedics swarmed the scene, assessing injuries and transporting the most critical cases to the nearest hospital. Evelyn sank to the ground, her body heavy with exhaustion. She watched as the paramedics loaded the young mother and her son into an ambulance, their tearful thanks echoing in her ears. Around her, the scene began to clear, the wreckage of the bus a stark reminder of the day's events. Frank was one of the last to be taken away, his legs splinted and his face still twisted with anger. He glanced at Evelyn as he was loaded onto a stretcher, his expression a mixture of resentment and something else she couldn't quite place. She didn't care. All that mattered was that everyone was alive. As the last ambulance pulled away, Evelyn remained seated by the side of the road, her mind racing with thoughts of what had happened and what it all meant. The day had been a stark reminder of the deep divisions that still plagued their society, but it had also shown her the strength and resilience that lay within her. She closed her eyes, the weight of the day finally catching up to her. For now, she allowed herself to rest, knowing that the fight was far from over. If you enjoyed this chapter, don't forget to like and subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more stories like this. Stay tuned, the journey continues. Evelyn woke with a start, her heart pounding as the memories of the crash surged back. The dim light of dusk had given way to night, and the field where the bus once stood was now eerily quiet. A paramedic had given her a quick once-over before leaving, assuring her that no bones were broken. Yet, the pain in her side and the throbbing in her head told her she wasn't entirely unharmed. She stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her dress, and surveyed the area. Most of the injured passengers had been taken to the hospital, but a few had been left behind, either too stubborn to leave or unwilling to admit their injuries. Frank Dawson was nowhere to be seen. "Evelyn, you all right?" a voice called out. Turning, she saw the young man who had reluctantly helped earlier. His name was Henry, she remembered. His face was pale, and a cut on his temple had left dried blood streaked across his cheek. "I'll be fine," Evelyn replied. "How about you?" Henry nodded, though he swayed slightly as he approached her. "Never been in a crash before," he admitted, his voice shaky. "That was something else." Evelyn offered a weak smile. "It's not something I'd like to repeat." A shared silence fell between them, broken only by the distant hum of crickets. Evelyn's thoughts drifted to the young mother and her son. She prayed they were safe and receiving the care they needed. Her mind also wandered to Frank, the belligerent bus driver whose face of anger was seared into her memory. There was something about his expression as he was taken away that gnawed at her. For all his faults, he looked scared. Not just of the crash, but of something deeper. Henry's voice broke through her thoughts. "I overheard one of the paramedics talkin'," he said, his tone hushed. "They said it didn't look like the bus, just stalled. They think someone tampered with it." Evelyn's breath caught. "Tampered? Are you sure?" Henry nodded solemnly. Said the brake lines looked like they'd been cut. Could have happened while it was parked overnight. Evelyn's mind raced. If what Henry said was true, the crash wasn't just an accident. Someone had wanted that bus to fail. But why? And who? Underscore 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 underscore. As the hours passed, Evelyn's exhaustion gave way to determination. She couldn't let this go unanswered. The lives of everyone on that bus had been put at risk, and for what? Anger simmered beneath her calm exterior as she resolved to find out the truth. The next morning, Evelyn made her way to the local bus depot. The small, unassuming building sat on the edge of town, surrounded by rows of buses, some shiny and new, others battered and old. She'd hoped to find someone who could answer her questions, but as she approached, she was met with a wall of silence. The few workers present avoided her gaze, their shoulders hunched as if weighed down by an invisible burden. She spotted a mechanic tinkering with a bus and approached him. "Excuse me," she began. "Do you know anything about the crash yesterday?" The man froze, his wrench clattering to the ground. He glanced around nervously before muttering, "Don't know nothin'," and hurrying off. Evelyn's frustration grew. Someone knew something, but fear was keeping them silent. She needed another way in. Underscore 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 underscore. Later that evening, Evelyn sat in her small apartment, staring at the notebook in front of her. She jotted down everything she'd learned so far, though it wasn't much. Her thoughts kept circling back to Frank. For all his bluster and cruelty, he might hold the answers she sought. Determined, she made her way to the hospital where he'd been taken. The sterile halls smelled of antiseptic and bleach, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. After some convincing, a nurse pointed her toward Frank's room. Evelyn hesitated outside the door, steeling herself. Then, she pushed it open. Frank lay in the bed, his leg in a cast, and his face turned toward the window. He didn't look up as she entered, but his jaw tightened. "What do you want?" he muttered. Evelyn took a deep breath. "I want to know the truth." Frank's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" "The crash," Evelyn said, stepping closer. "It wasn't an accident, was it? Someone tampered with the bus." Frank's face darkened, and for a moment, Evelyn thought he might deny it. But then his shoulders sagged, and he let out a heavy sigh. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said quietly. Evelyn's heart raced. "Then help me understand." People's lives were put at risk. "Why? Who would do something like that?" Frank hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. Finally, he spoke. "There's things going on in this town that you don't know about. Things that people like me get caught up in whether we like it or not." "What things?" Evelyn pressed. Frank shook his head. "I've already said too much. You want to get yourself killed, that's your business. But don't come back here asking questions." Evelyn's frustration boiled over. "People nearly died, Frank. You can't just keep quiet about this." Frank's eyes locked with hers, a flicker of fear and something else passing through them. Then he turned away, refusing to say another word. Evelyn left the hospital with more questions than answers. As she walked through the quiet streets, her mind churned with possibilities. Who would want to sabotage the bus? And why was Frank so afraid to talk? She didn't notice the figure watching her from the shadows until it was too late. A hand clamped over her mouth, and a voice hissed in her ear. "You need to stop asking questions, Missy. Some things are better left alone." Evelyn's blood ran cold as she struggled against the iron grip. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the faint glow of a cigarette in the darkness. Like and subscribe for more stories like this. Evelyn's head throbbed as she slowly regained consciousness. The sharp smell of damp wood and mildew filled her nostrils, and her cheek pressed against a rough, uneven surface. It took a moment for her to realize she was lying on the floor of what felt like a small, confined room. The faint glow of a single bulb overhead illuminated the bare walls, revealing the splintered wood of a decrepit cabin. She tried to move, but her wrists were bound behind her, the coarse rope biting into her skin. Panic surged through her as the events leading up to this moment came rushing back. The shadowy figure, the rough grip, and the whispered warning. Struggling against her restraints, she managed to shift into a sitting position, her eyes darting around the room for any sign of escape. The sound of footsteps outside made her freeze. A door creaked open, and a man stepped inside, his face obscured by the shadow cast from the light above. He took a slow drag of his cigarette, the ember glowing brightly before he exhaled a cloud of smoke. "You should have listened," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Some questions don't have answers you're ready to hear." Evelyn's voice was steady despite the fear coursing through her veins.
Why?
"Why sabotage the bus? Who are you working for?" The man chuckled darkly. "It's not about the bus, lady. It's about control. About keeping things the way they are." "People could have died," Evelyn snapped, her anger overriding her fear. "You put innocent lives at risk just to send a message." "Innocent?" the man sneered, stepping closer. "Ain't nobody innocent in this town. Everyone's got a part to play, whether they know it or not." Evelyn's mind raced. His words hinted at a larger conspiracy, one that went beyond Frank and the bus crash. She needed more information, but the man seemed content to keep his secrets. Her gaze flicked to the room around her, searching for anything she could use to her advantage. "You don't have to do this," she said, trying to keep him talking. "Whatever you're caught up in, you can still make it right." The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then he shook his head and turned away.
"It's too late for that."
Before Evelyn could respond, the door creaked open again, and another figure entered the room. This one was taller, dressed in a sharp suit that seemed out of place in the dilapidated cabin. His presence commanded attention, and even the cigarette-smoking man stepped back slightly. "Enough," the suited man said, his tone calm but firm. He looked down at Evelyn with cold, calculating eyes. "You've caused quite a stir, Miss Carter. Asking questions, poking your nose where it doesn't belong. I'd hoped you'd let it go, but clearly, that was too much to expect." Evelyn met his gaze, refusing to show fear. "If you wanted to scare me off, you should have done a better job. I'm not going anywhere until I find out the truth." The man's lips curved into a thin smile. "You're braver than most." "Foolish, but brave." "Unfortunately, bravery won't save you." He motioned to the cigarette-smoking man, who stepped forward and hauled Evelyn to her feet. Her wrists ached as the rope cut deeper, but she refused to cry out. The suited man leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This town has rules, Miss Carter. Rules that keep the peace. When people start breaking those rules, there are consequences." Evelyn stared at him, her jaw set. "You call this peace? Putting lives at risk to protect your secrets?" The man's smile faded. "You don't understand the bigger picture. And you won't live long enough to." He straightened, his expression hardening. "Take her to the river. Make sure she doesn't come back." Evelyn's heart pounded as the cigarette-smoking man dragged her toward the door. Desperation surged through her veins, and she struggled against his grip, her mind racing for a way out. As they stepped into the cool night air, she caught sight of a broken shard of glass glinting in the moonlight near the cabin's entrance. Without thinking, she twisted sharply, throwing her weight to one side. The man cursed as he lost his balance, and Evelyn seized the opportunity. She lunged for the glass, gripping it tightly despite the sharp sting as it cut into her palm. In one swift motion, she sawed through the rope binding her wrists and spun to face her captor. The cigarette-smoking man recovered quickly, lunging at her with a snarl. But Evelyn was ready. She ducked under his grasp and drove the shard of glass into his arm. He let out a cry of pain, giving her just enough time to run. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense and dark, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her as she fled. Branches snagged at her clothes, and the uneven ground threatened to trip her with every step. She could hear the men shouting behind her, their voices growing louder as they closed in. Panic threatened to consume her, but she forced herself to focus. Up ahead, she spotted the faint glimmer of water through the trees. The river. If she could reach it, she might have a chance to escape. Her lungs burned and her legs ached as she pushed herself harder, the sound of rushing water growing louder with each step. But just as she broke through the tree-line, a hand clamped around her arm, yanking her back. "Not so fast," growled the cigarette-smoking man, his face twisted with rage. Blood dripped from his arm where she'd stabbed him, but he didn't seem to care. Evelyn struggled, kicking and clawing as he dragged her toward the riverbank. She could see the suited man standing nearby, his expression unreadable as he watched the scene unfold. "End it," he said coldly. The cigarette-smoking man nodded, pulling Evelyn closer to the water. She fought with every ounce of strength she had, but his grip was like iron. As the river's icy waters lapped at her feet, she realized with a sinking feeling that she might not get out of this alive. And then, out of the darkness, came a deafening crack. The cigarette-smoking man released her with a grunt, his body crumpling to the ground. Evelyn stumbled back, her eyes wide as she turned to see Henry standing at the edge of the forest, a shotgun in his trembling hands. "Run," he shouted. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She turned and plunged into the river, the cold water stealing her breath as she fought against the current. Behind her, she could hear shouts and gunfire, but she didn't look back. Her only thought was to survive. Like and subscribe for more stories like this. Evelyn fought against the river's powerful current, her limbs trembling with exhaustion. The icy water numbed her skin, but the sheer will to survive kept her moving. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, each one a battle against the freezing rush that threatened to pull her under. Behind her, she could still hear faint shouts and the sporadic crack of gunfire, but the sounds grew more distant with every stroke. She spotted a cluster of rocks jutting out from the riverbank and paddled toward them, her fingers gripping the rough, slippery surface as she pulled herself to safety. Her chest heaved as she collapsed onto the cold, solid ground, the water dripping from her clothes forming a small pool beneath her. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. But her respite was short-lived. A rustling sound from the nearby trees jolted her upright. Her heart pounded as she scanned the darkness, half expecting one of her pursuers to emerge. Instead, Henry stumbled out, his face pale and his shotgun slung over his shoulder. "You made it," he said, his voice hoarse with relief. Evelyn nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She pushed herself to her feet, leaning against the rocks for support. "Thank you," she managed to croak, her voice barely audible over the river's roar. Henry gave a faint smile. "Didn't think I'd actually hit him," he admitted, glancing back toward the forest. "We need to keep moving. They won't stop looking for you." Evelyn's mind raced. The suited man's words echoed in her head, rules that keep the peace. Whatever conspiracy she'd stumbled into, it was bigger than she'd imagined. And now she had a target on her back. "Do you know where this river leads?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Henry nodded. "There's an old boathouse about a mile downstream. My uncle used to fish there. It's abandoned, but we can lay low for a while." Evelyn hesitated. Every instinct told her to keep running, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the men who'd tried to kill her. But she also needed answers, and Henry seemed to know more than he let on. "Let's go," she said finally. The trek along the riverbank was grueling. The uneven terrain and biting wind sapped what little strength Evelyn had left. Henry led the way, his movements cautious and deliberate, as if he expected an ambush at any moment. The moonlight cast long shadows across the water, creating an eerie stillness that set Evelyn's nerves on edge. When they finally reached the boathouse, it was little more than a crumbling shack perched precariously over the water. The wooden planks creaked under their weight as they stepped inside. Henry rummaged through a rusted metal chest in the corner and pulled out a dusty lantern. With a flick of his lighter, the small flame illuminated the room, casting flickering shadows on the peeling walls. "It's not much, but it'll do," Henry said, setting the lantern on a makeshift table. Evelyn sank onto an old wooden bench, her body aching from the ordeal. "Why did you come after me?" she asked, her gaze fixed on Henry. "You didn't have to get involved." Henry hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. "Because I know what they're capable of," he said quietly. "I've seen it before. People disappear in this town if they ask too many questions. I couldn't let that happen to you." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "Who are they?" she pressed. "What are they hiding?" Henry sat across from her, his expression grim. "It's not just about the bus," he began. "There's a network of powerful people in this town. Politicians, businessmen, law enforcement. They control everything from the factories to the schools. And they'll do whatever it takes to keep their grip on power." Evelyn's mind reeled. She'd always known there were injustices in her town, but she hadn't realized the extent of the corruption. "Why the bus?" she asked. "What were they trying to achieve?" Henry shook his head. "I don't know all the details, but I overheard something about a shipment. Something they didn't want anyone to see. The crash was a distraction. They needed chaos to cover their tracks." Evelyn's jaw tightened. Innocent lives had been endangered, all to protect a secret shipment. Her anger burned brighter than her fear now. "We have to expose them," she said firmly. "People need to know what's happening." Henry's expression darkened. "And what happens when they come after you again? After both of us? You think the sheriff's going to help? He's in their pocket, just like everyone else." "Then we find someone who's not," Evelyn shot back. "There has to be someone willing to stand up to them." Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're braver than most, Evelyn. But bravery's not enough. These people, they don't play fair." A heavy silence settled between them. Evelyn knew the risks, but she couldn't walk away. Not after everything she'd seen. Not after everything she'd survived. Suddenly, the distant sound of a motorboat echoed across the river. Henry's head snapped up, his eyes widening in alarm. "They've found us," he said, grabbing the shotgun and extinguishing the lantern. Evelyn's heart raced as she peered through a crack in the wall. A small boat approached, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Two figures stood on the deck, their silhouettes unmistakable. "What do we do?" she whispered. Henry's grip on the shotgun tightened. "We fight." Like and subscribe for more stories like this.